Hello, everybody. Welcome. So glad to have you with me today, wherever and whenever you may be listening. I'm going to be speaking this afternoon about the same topic that I made my previous video on, the UFO and UAP phenomena. The last video was pretty much off the cuff, and I had just heard the allegations put forward by David Grush. A lot of new information has come to light since then. I've had a chance to spend a great deal of time researching, listening to other speakers, Grush himself, Avi Loeb, whose name I may be mispronouncing, Diana Walsh-Paluska, and a number of other speakers, particularly on the Concrete with a K podcast. I've also done quite a bit of reading and research. I've followed this phenomena since approximately 1969 and have been fascinated with the possibilities of contact with non-human intelligence. Now, when we use this word in the modern vernacular, this generally refers to beings that are either non-physical, so these would be beings that we might ordinarily think of as divine, beings that could be extra-dimensional, that live in dimensions we don't even have language about, not the ordinary physical, like 3 physical dimensions plus time, or even necessarily the dimensionality that we might associate with quantum physics or related fields. And then beings that we would consider to be extraterrestrial. So that class would be beings relatively similar to us, beings who are physical, biological organisms that evolved either in space-time itself, but more primarily on, physical planets, solar systems, and so on. So there's a broad range of phenomena that are captured under the umbrella of NHI. I think it's very important to understand that our species has been terracentric and what we might call anthrocentric, especially over the past, say, 2,000 years. Our ideas about the nature of intelligence, what organisms mean and are, or could be, what time-space means, or is, and could be, are not only incredibly primitive, and in many cases mostly wrong. We clearly exist in a hyperstructure of bioreelational intelligences here on Earth. And I'm not merely speaking about the biological creatures that we recognize some degree of intelligence or that we would call sentient or so on in. Creatures like dolphins, whales, bonobos, gorillas, and more recently, the corvid birds, right? The magpies, crows, ravens, jays, who clearly over, the span during which they have been synanthropic with us, right, have acquired some degree of the capacity to solve the kinds of problems that we associate with our own cognitive abilities and faculties. So I think that we're, as a species, catastrophically confused. Our lexicons, the core elements in these lexicons, elements like world, sun, animal, plant, organism, dream, mind. Most of the roots of our lexicons are extremely narrowly and confusingly defined. And they inherit the biases that come with terracentrism and anthropocentrism. And those biases are deeply blinding. The nature of organismal life on Earth is pure science fiction compared to how modern humans and even most of the scientific community are inclined to frame them, right? And those frames are very constrictive, and they evict probably 90 or more percent of what's actually accessible to us and what we could reasonably say is going on, right? Is happening. The bioreelational hyperstructures that form the living membrane on our planet are unimaginably sophisticatedly profound. They are accessible to human beings, but generally this requires specialized training or contexts in which the many faculties that we bring to our human birth could be recognized, developed, nurtured, expanded, and enhanced. So we're living in a time where the information that we're exposed to is mostly wrong. The organismal membranes of Earth, particularly the microbial, viral, and single-celled layers of the biological hyperstructures are unimaginably profound. And if our ideas about evolution are actually modestly correct, then it would appear that the profuse library of species here were effectively assembled by microbial intelligences. So all of the animals, all of the plants, all of the insects, the fungi, these would all be the result of the developments that emerge from microbial biorelation. I don't know whether that's true, whether our ideas about evolution make sense. We would have to presume that A, there was pretty much no input from time-space other than its nature, and B, that there was no intelligent modulation of the biosphere by other intelligences or beings. And those are really monumental assumptions. The other thing that I want to mention, which I've mentioned many times before, is that we have the wrong idea about the nature of time-space itself and also about the nature of organisms. So we've only just, over the past maybe 70, 80 years, come to understand that the concepts of time and space are inseparable. Einstein, in his relativity theories, essentially corrected a fundamental error here and made it clear that time-space has to be thought of as, space is essentially the fourth dimension. So these things have to be thought of together. This has broad implications that we have failed to understand, particularly about the nature of time. In Einstein's theory, although we got this right about the particles, we didn't understand the implications for organisms, consciousness, and so on. In Einstein's theory, one important feature is the concept of a world line, which is the path through time-space, which on Earth is going to be doing this, right? That an organism inhabits over the span of its lifetime. And also, not just the path, the sort of tunnel, right, that the physical body of the organism comprises um, from beginning to end, right? That's moving around on the surface of the Earth. The Earth is spinning, and the Earth is being dragged through time-space by the sun in a sort of moving spiral. And then the sun is being dragged around in the galaxy, and of course the galaxy is moving. So all of these features would give the shape of the path in time of a given organism's world line. Each organism has a unique world line. The concept of non-simultaneity implies that each organism can be reasonably thought of as a distinct reference frame, the only reference frame for that organism. Now, of course, the organism is buried in layered reference frames, but the organism itself comprises one. And what that means is that no other organism will receive the same signals from the environment, the same stimuli in the same way as an individual does. Now, organisms can sort of travel together, right? Obviously, we have about 45 trillion cells in our bodies. Each of those has its own world line. The relationships between them form a reference frame. So there's a collective reference frame, but each organism is also distinct. And that has incredible implications for time. I'll give you some simple examples. When we measure time, we measure it with a single world line. So when we ask ourselves, what's the age of the universe? We throw all the world lines out and pretend that the universe itself has just one world line, which isn't entirely wrong, but it's also incomplete in dramatic ways. That age that we ascribe to the universe is approximately 13.5 billion years. It could turn out that there are features of time that we don't understand that make that wrong. It's certainly wrong if we include just the world lines of the galaxies, right? Because if we have one world line for each galaxy, then that 13.5 billion years has to be multiplied by the number of galaxies there are. I don't know that number, but it's a catastrophically huge number. It also means that the nature of time here on Earth is radically different from everything we think. If there are 8 billion humans, 1 year on Earth is 8 billion human life years. Each of those humans has 45 trillion cells in them. The biosphere itself has countless myriads of organisms. So if we look at just one species, right, take the housefly, and we multiply time by how many houseflies there have been since they've existed, we get a number like that resembles 500 billion housefly life years. What that means is nature has run 500 billion housefly experiments on Earth, and the intelligence that results from adaptation in the species over that time is unimaginable. It's not the same kind of intelligence that we have. It's not a cognitive intelligence precisely. It's certainly not a representational intelligence where the houseflies have tokens that they use to refer to stuff. But the physicalization of that intelligence is profound. So what you get is a physicalized embodiment of 500 billion life years of houseflies on Earth. A single house, and this is if housefly time is the same as it is for humans. And if we take as a metric events per second per organism, we could imagine usefully that the housefly's temporality is different from ours, so that effectively one human lifespan is compressed into one housefly lifespan. And so with this idea, we get that different organisms experience time at different rates, right? 1 minute for a cell is not the same minute as it is for an elephant, for example. But just presuming that houseflies experience time at the same rate we do to keep things simpler, a single housefly would have 235 quadrillion ancestors. So you can see that if there's been 500 billion housefly years on Earth, if we add all the other organisms on Earth, including microbes, plants, animals, and so on, what we get is a biorelational hyperstructure in time, where the organisms are actually creating different modes of time, and this happens in our own bodies with our organs. The modes of time, biorelational time, that our heart experiences are not the same thing as our liver, lungs, pancreas, kidneys, so on, brain, whatever. So we have very crude ideas about time, and that causes us to think about phenomena in extremely confused and mostly wrong ways. Obviously, non-human intelligences, if we're referring to intelligences that aren't native to the surface of the Earth, those beings would certainly have radically different ideas about the nature of biology, evolution, time-space, what's going on, fundamental principles in their if they have lexicons, and we can presume they have something that resembles them, even though they probably don't have the same kind of representational consciousness we have, their ideas would be dramatically different from ours. And I know this from direct experience. In 2002, I had a 9-month contact with a non-human intelligence, during which my lexicons were radically revised. And everything that I had ever thought about anything was transformed. And much of what I talk about in my videos is the result of those transformations. I'm not here to talk about that today, but in terms of the existence of non-human intelligence, I don't merely believe it the way someone who's heard something from someone else or read it in a book believes it. I believe it in the same way that I have experience of eating food, right? Or seeing the sun, feeling warmth on my skin. I believe it in the sense that I have direct, rich, reliable experience of it, just as reliable as, the solidity of physical objects and so on. So for me, these topics are very important because even though I've had this direct experience that's very profound, in fact, more profound than anything I ever imagined possible, I'm very curious about the experiences of others, and these are often dismissed as anecdotal and so on, and in some cases that's a reasonable move. In many other cases, it's not a reasonable move. There are hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, who've had a direct experience of either contact with an anomalous phenomena, something that's outside our lexicons, and that's what we mean by anomalous. We mean doesn't fit in the lexicons we're familiar with. Surely some of those experiences are more or less psychological, but they also partake of the features that are native to the domains of myth. And by myth, I don't mean fake story. I mean the dimension of human experience that is not merely physical, right? So they relate with myth. They're certainly a huge part, if not the actual foundation, of the idea of religion, because all of our religions, they make the claim that the ideas and the lexicons associated with them are the result of contact with non-human intelligence, whether that is contact with God, contact with Jesus, contact with Muhammad or Allah, contact with angels, contact with cherubim. So all of our religions have this origin in non-ordinary experience, right? Experience which is from a dimension above the physical. And we don't have good language about this. We have the idea of the psyche. It's a convenient array of complex concepts, but it doesn't capture much generally that would allow us to understand or articulate features of human non-ordinary experience. So since Grush's allegations, and the allegations are fairly simple to state, they are that the United States government is now and has long been in possession of materials, vehicles, and corpses that come from a non-terrestrial intelligence that is apparently at least para-technological, and that this has been going on for about 50 years, and that this has been hidden from the American people. That last part's not surprising, but the sort of origin of the problem is that the government, our government, which we should never think of as a single entity, right? There's nothing like the way that we think about corporations and governments. We think of them as if they are people, most of us, most of the time. And this is impossible. They don't have brains, they don't have hemispheres, right? There's a lot of sort of para-left hemispheric like structure and concern, and there's nearly zero right hemispheric interruption, correction, so forth. So they're nothing like people. They're complex processes that capture our population at the order where we make groups. And we understand the idea of like departments, right? So they have a complex structure that resembles slightly the idea of organs. Yeah. And they are not univocal, right? They don't speak with one voice. We pretend they speak with one voice. We elect, people to run them and helm or pilot or navigate, make the high level decisions. But they're a vast tree of little hierarchical pieces of process that link together to form a whole, and then that whole competes in the world and in human culture and thought and society as if it were a person in an actual competition for power, resources, longevity, and the capacity to reproduce in various ways or spawn sub-processes. In our modern situation, this is pretty much the greatest danger that not just we as human beings, but life on Earth faces. These processes are not human. They are in no way answerable to human concerns. They are fundamentally oriented to obliterate the anciently conserved ecologies, which are the basis of life on Earth, and our own humanity, bodies and minds, moment to moment, not just in a cause and effect, like someday it'll affect us kind of thing. No, the biosphere is intimately integrated biorelationally, so damage anywhere in that hyperstructure lands in us instantly, right? Just as if, in the same way that when my body is physically injured, it's not my whole body which is injured, but is my whole body which experiences injury and the repercussions of that injury. And yes, those stack up over time and so forth. They ramify over time. So the primary problem here is that it is the idea of what we refer to as national security, which is a ridiculously ironic idea because effectively what it means is the capacity to defend our nation, which itself is a fiction, a deadly, lethal fiction, from other nations or other threats. And this idea is very confused for a wide variety of reasons, the simplest of which being that when two actual beings meet, whether or not they think of each other as enemies, there's an ambiguity space, right, in which those beings can negotiate identity, relationship, meaning, values, and so on. There are many ancient indigenous stories of two enemies meeting, discovering that they are actually enemies representationally, right? A is the enemy of B. We're coming together. I see there's a person over here. As they get closer, I see, oh, they belong to a tribe. And as they get closer, I see, oh, they belong to this tribe. And this tribe is known to be the enemy of this tribe. But then as they get closer, they negotiate their relationship and often refute the idea that they're enemies at all, come together, transform the lexicon. We are companions, right? So there's this negotiation phase, and our representational cultures dismiss that. The way that we treat identity in language is usually crude and explicit, so that if we're at war with China, Chinese people are our enemies, right? If we could be at war with China, Chinese people are probably our enemies, and so forth. That's insane, right? That's the opposite of security, because the fundamental power of that leads to anything resembling security is the power to renegotiate enmity, right? In such a way that we form alliances where, under the rules of explicit identity, we would have to just simply enter combat. So the departments in our government that are tasked with behaviors and research and weapons development and so on, that fall under the aegis of national security, actually, to some vast degree, have the opposite effect. They, for example, will immediately attack anything that appears, like once the perceived threat reaches a certain level, it goes directly to combat. There's no negotiation. You can see the same principle in individual humans who believe, for example, that anyone entering their property, quote unquote, that they have the right to kill them, because they see their property as the same as their body, and so anything that enters there without, pre-negotiated agreement should just be killed. And there are plenty of insane people like that. My point is that nothing is less secure than the way we're running the United States government. We're essentially using something like an operating system, and most of the modern nations are like this, that more resembles malware than an operating system. If we could look at a computer that simulated the actual activity of the United States government over time, no one would sign up for that. Nearly no one. We would realize this thing's just producing new forms of damage, insanity, and disease every time it makes a move in billions of little departments and functions and shit. So no one would sign up for it if we could actually see what is truly going on. We can't. And the primary reason why the American people are being denied access to the knowledge and perhaps technology and materials that are almost certainly in the possession of the United States government and have long been, is because the departments associated with this research, development, reverse engineering, and so on, belong to the Department of Defense. And since they belong to that department, anything can pretty much be blanket hidden under the concept that it is or could be a threat to national security. Now, once again, if we actually wanted a secure environment, we would have to have something that resembles an intelligent government and society. There are no such things really on Earth. There are small examples of groups of humans that are attempting this experiment. But we live in our modern time in a situation where every minute that passes, the chance that one of the governments of Earth will make a move that will result in nuclear war or biological war, or even these days information warfare that will lead to endgame for life on Earth increase dramatically. Once you have, five, I'm going to make up a number here. Once you have like 200 nuclear submarines, each with the physical capacity to obliterate Europe entirely, or at least vast portions of it, and all of the other bizarre, military devices and technologies and so on. Once we're supporting that 24/7, there's going to be, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? So there's nothing less secure than that. We'd almost be better off having, well, certainly humanity would be better off if we just all decided that we're going to dismantle all weapons of war. We're going to stop supporting that idea, because A, the environment can't support it. B, it will lead necessarily to total environmental catastrophe, the obliteration of our species and maybe most of animal life on Earth. There's nothing secure about that. It's absolutely imperative that we learn at the group level to form intelligent cohorts that are disinclined to battle, or perhaps battle only representationally and not physically, right? So that we have games instead of wars, and then we can decide the outcome of conflict based on games. War is essentially similar to that. The problem is that it wasn't too big a problem when all we had was spears or arrow, even bow and arrows. Once we had guns, that radically transformed the nature of life on Earth for every animal and many other creatures. One wonders how many trees have taken a bullet, right? And then once we got explosives, that just led to the eventual development of nuclear weapons, and then things like neutron bombs, which only kill the organisms but don't affect the physical structure. So we're in a situation where my perspective is that almost certainly the government is in possession of materials, craft, and bodies that don't, while some of them may originate on Earth, and we'll get into that, they are non-human, right? They are technologies assembled by not humans. And they've probably been in possession of that material for a long time. It seems relatively unlikely that the US government will simply come forward and say, yep, it's true, we've got this stuff. The implications for national security are too catastrophic. And as I mentioned before, we have this problem where we're running a bunch of malware, and the malware is based on the idea that individual groups of humans are the most important thing in the universe, and the groups of humans that live right now are the most important thing in the universe, right? We don't care really what happens at all. Those groups don't care at all about our children, what happens in the future. If we obliterate the environment, they'll happily, even as scarcity, right, grows due to the environmental impact of our group activity, we're just going to double down on that threat, right? If we tell people like there's only 400,000 tuna left in the ocean, that doesn't lead to the conservation of tuna circa 2023. That leads to grabopoly, right? Get all the tuna you can right now, forget about the future, store those tuna in freezers, sell them for $6 to $8 million a piece, right? Because if there's not going to be any more, now the value of tuna skyrockets. So there's a race to the bottom that's going on. And this is catastrophically terrifying to every human being on Earth. This is a degree of injustice that is at least as serious as just putting bullets in people's heads, like just pointing guns at our children and blowing them up. And it's just that dangerous. But because it because its repercussions have a time scale rather than being instantaneous, the groups don't ascribe the same threat value to these processes. And they can be come vocabulary. Damage can be displaced into the future. And the other thing we don't realize is that when we're blowing things up and ripping the environment and the human societies to shreds for the sake of commerce and war and power, we don't realize that that actually changes the meaning of history, right? It changes the meaning of what came before. Because anything that we do now transforms the meaning of all events in the past, so that, for example, all the dreams of humanity over the entire span of our species, the visions and hopes and urgent imperatives of our hearts and spirits and souls and origin, those get denigrated, right? We don't care. We just do whatever seems important right now, like a drug addict or an insane animal or something. And so that changes the meaning of our entire ancestral line. It changes the meaning of the history of life on Earth. And at the same time, it obliterates the future, right? It displaces threat from the immediate moment onto future generations of all of life on Earth. So the humans are in a very unusual position. We're in the position that whether or not we have some divine mandate to be the caretakers of each other in life on Earth, it turns out that we are in that position because there are no other organisms or beings that we know of in our common lexicons that could interrupt it or stop us, or affect, anything that we're doing. So we are in the position to either dispose of the entire life history of this planet explosively or, catastrophically, just tear it to shreds, and the future. But we also have the same capacity to fulfill, right? If we could do something so amazing and beautiful and humane together, that all of our ancestors would stand up in their graves and cheer, finally, the most urgent imperatives of our humanity and our organismal nature and so on have been seen and are being embodied and are being enacted. That is the direction in which hope lies, however unlikely that may seem. So that's a lot of background. It seems very unlikely to me that the United States government will simply come forward and say, yes, we're in possession of these objects, these craft, these technologies, and bodies. There may be sort of a partial move in that direction, but even that move would catastrophically destabilize all of the structures of concept and authorization, political, commercial, religious, and so on, philosophical, that underpin our societies, what we call civilization, which is pretty much the opposite of anything resembling that, would be completely undermined by the introduction of the realization that we're not alone, right? This would catastrophically interrupt the vast array of lethal fictions that we presently live within and serve. The idea, what it means to be human, circa 2023, we're living in basically a science fiction story, right? Where 97% of what it means to be human is almost completely unavailable to nearly all of us. If you could imagine a child that lived in a room and had never seen nature, and there are just projections on the walls of this room of products and, you know, ideologies and religions and concepts and so on. And the child never has the ability to taste or experience its actual nature as a being. That's what's going on today. And the idea that the government, which is sort of the purveyor and the origin of nearly all of these fictions, would suddenly come to the people and say, hey, you know, we've had this wrong the whole time. We're not the most important thing going on around here. Time space itself is intelligent, which it almost certainly is. We have the wrong idea of like the universe, right? And if you get that idea wrong, you're not going to be able to get any smaller idea correct at all. The way that human cognition works is that it's based on roots, which I call holophores. And the supercontainer is the uppermost or innermost concept. So if you get that one wrong, or if you get any of the related ideas, like what the sun is or is doing, what the earth is or is doing, what organisms are or are being, if you get any of those severely wrong, every other idea inherits that damage. Similarly, if you can correct any of those even slightly, that correction propagates through the entire lexicon. So there's a technology here that's available to us, which is related to our nature as formal representational cognitive animals. I think one of the great tragedies is that the scope of our humanity is incredibly vast, rich, and deep, beyond anything. If we could get even a glimpse of this, it would obliterate religions and governments and corporations and all of that. That stuff would just go away. We are fundamentally more than human. 98% of what we are is more than human. First, we are the universe itself. We are the universe making little universes within itself. Then we are beings, right? And although the language is tricky, we are souls. It's not that we have souls, we belong to a network which we are instances of. So after we are beings, or actually before we are beings, we are souls, we are beings, we are so let me start this over. First of all, whatever the universe is, we are that. Whatever galaxies are, we are that. Whatever solar systems are, we are that. Whatever stars are, we are that. Whatever living worlds are, we are that. And then we are organisms, and then we are animals, and then we are human animals. Right? And there's a similar cone, right? Big cone that comes down to a point where we really don't have the right language for this. Because if we say we are souls, that acquires all of the connotations of religion and so on. But I would say that we are more than human, and we'll use the word spiritual to represent that. And then we are beings, and then, you know, the same sort of thing, right? We are organisms, we are animals, we are human animals, we are formally, representationally cognitive human animals, and then we are like humans circa 2023. So 98%, probably more, 99.9% of what we actually are is invisible to us. And it's invisible to our lexicons, to our concepts, and that's mostly what makes it invisible to us. And this issue of UFOs and UAPs and so on relates to this problem specifically. And this is why it's fundamentally a mythical problem, a religious problem, a psychological problem, a social problem, a governmental problem, you know, a societal problem. But let's just bear in mind that, again, it's the same thing. 98% of what's going on is unavailable to our lexicons. And so scientists aren't going to reveal this to you. It would destroy their reputations and what they do for a living. The religious people aren't going to reveal this to you. It would obliterate human religion, right? because Jesus is essentially, whether we pick whatever religion we pick, right? The the God image is actually an overlay on the spiritual nature of time-space, right? So anything that threatens that will likely cause war. So we're in a situation where no matter what's actually going on, and I promise you what is actually going on is vastly more bizarre and weird than anything we're capable of thinking. Unfortunately, our lexicons are so primitive and damaged that there's no way for us to entertain the concepts that would allow us to expand beyond that 0.1% of our knowledge and identity without threatening it. And the vast majority of humans are captured entirely by these lexicons, concepts, governments, corporations, and so on, nations, and religious affiliations, and so on. So any revelation that we're not alone would threaten the entire structure of all of that. It would destroy our ontology in a single swipe, right? Our ontology meaning like what our world image is. So it's very unlikely that any government is, whether they're in, no matter what they're in possession of. First of all, it should be clear that governments and their sub-branches, particularly the military sub-branches, are entirely the wrong organ to understand, contact, or relate with any phenomenon like this. And this is part of the problem. We don't at present have an organ that is reasonably endowed or capable of freely exploring what is available to explore. Right? And even the idea of what's going on is wrong, because the way that time-space is and the way life on Earth is, they're so profound that the actual nature of reality is incomplete. It's completed by relation, participation, exploration, learning, growth, the introduction or development of faculties that were previously inhibited or prohibited, so that it's as if reality is layered, right, at the core or at the outside, whichever. You can go from outside in or inside out. At the core, you have unity. Everything is one, all the time, every moment. Beyond that, you have possibility, right? So unity, possibility, probability, likelihood, determinism, and then physical structure. So the physical structure, which is what we believe in, is probably less than 2% of what's going on, quote unquote. So we're not going to get an idea of what's going on that is explicit. And that's the idea that we have when we use the word reality. We mean what is actually the case. But the way that time, space, and consciousness and the universe is not what is actually the case, right? What is actually the case is a tiny overlay, a superficial overlay, where what we call physical laws are true, right? So that part of reality is less than 2% of what's going on. You're never going to capture what's going on under the aegis of what is actually the case, right? That'll never happen. Because what's going on is potential that transforms in relation toward the physical reality layer or toward the unity layer, or both. So most of what's going on isn't going on until we relate with it, right? And this is obvious. We can believe that physical reality is transient, explicit. This is hard stuff. We know that the table's going to be there when I come back later, and so on. But the portion of reality that represents is minuscule. And our lexicons are not capable of entertaining these ideas yet. Now, the hope is that we can transform our lexicons so that we can begin to open the terrain that's accessible to us in relation, in consciousness, in understanding. And that's a real hope that we can actually do, right? Like once we understand that we're catastrophically confused and trapped in a tiny portion of our ability, nature, faculties, and so on, we can learn together, especially with people who are aware of this and can teach us um, how to proceed toward climbing toward the possibilities of our human nature. But until we form collectives that are actually oriented toward that rather than sort of competition, grabopoly, and so on, we're going to be stuck here. And more than likely, we're not going to be able, it's too late, right? More than likely, it's too late. Nonetheless, when a house is on fire, even if it's going to burn down, you save everyone you can. You form, collectives that are intelligently organized to deal with the problem. And so that's open to us as people and as individuals. And that's part of why I make these videos, is in the hope of pursuing that together. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the UFO UAP thing. Because we have the wrong idea of what time-space is, and I'm going to argue that time-space is a being, or it's a layered array of beings, right? There's like something like, this is a cartoon, but there's something like God, which is all beings in unity at all moments. And then there are layered sort of hierarchies of beings. The lexicon's a problem, but we could go from God to angels to little angels that are more function. The big angels are intelligent, right? Then there's little angels that are more like functions. These could be understood as the fingertips of God, the angels. They do things. They're the inaction aspect of the being that dwells in unity, who lives within the living waters, and so on. And this is just a toy, right? I'm not asking you to believe this. Then we have like complex hierarchies of non-human intelligences, and then we have embodiments of those intelligences that are either partly physical or can be physicalized, right, spontaneously. And then we have, physical organisms, biology, and so on. And then we have matter itself, right? And matter could be at a different place in that hierarchy. So there's this layered array of hierarchies of intelligence. And by intelligence, I mean insight, not technical ability. I mean wisdom, vast historical understanding, something like a living library that is infinitely co-intelligent, right? Infinite layers of intelligence that form derivations in time space. So in that model, what we would see is there probably are, almost there certainly are, other living worlds and other living worlds that have developed organisms like us. The question of evolution is kind of open, because either evolution sort of happens naturally in time space and living worlds develop life on their own, or there are beings involved in transmitting life between worlds that could become rich biological planets like ours. And probably a little bit of both, right? Evolution is real in the sense that if you seed a planet, it will evolve, with or without further intelligent manipulation. Yeah. So it seems clear that something very strange is going on in terms of how we would normally conceptualize things. These phenomena that we associate with UFOs and UAPs represent a broad range of different kinds of phenomena, and they have a lot to do with the nature of consciousness and the nature of souls and the nature of the psyche, right? They're not merely there may be instances that are merely technological, but that's very unlikely and probably represents a very small piece of the picture. Gary Nolan, who I think was probably cribbing from Jacques Vallée, said, if there were non-human intelligences and they had any intention of communicating with humans, they would come to the humans through the interfaces that the humans recognize in that time. So like 50,000 years ago, these would be spirit beings from the sky or the forest, or both. 10,000 years ago, these would be divine beings, gods and angels. In our time, these would look to us like technological beings. But they aren't any of those three things, or they are all of those three things and something else that our lexicons have no placeholders for. If the government is in possession of vehicles, materials, and bodies, it should be eminently clear that they are incapable of understanding them. So they will see them, they will want to see them as military or technological or both, when in fact they are probably mostly neither of those things. So in one sense, it would be difficult for the government to say, we have stuff, right? Actually, it would be simple for them to say we have stuff, and we have bodies and so on. It would be very difficult for them to say what it is. They'd have to say we don't understand it. And it's unlikely for the government to come to its own people and say, we're dumb. We don't know what's going on, man. We got these things. We can't tell. Are these beings? Are they spirits? Well, you know, they have machines, but they're not merely mechanical machines. They're not merely biotech. Like biotech is involved, but there are other features that don't make sense. It would be very unlikely for the government to do that. And if the departments of the government involved in these things were to come forward, it would make them look stupid, right? They'd be like, we don't know. We got this stuff. We're sorry we lied. Sorry we kept it from you. So I think that's very unlikely. Now, there are a lot of people who are trying to disambiguate the phenomena. And there's another feature here that's really important. There are two kinds of intelligence, right? One of them disambiguates. It takes a manifold of possibilities and collapses it to the branches, and then, you know, tries to make the final derivation of one or two branches. But there's another form of intelligence that's actually far more intelligent, and animals and plants do this all the time, which is the intelligent reambiguation. So you disambiguate a little bit, and then you reambiguate intelligently, and then you disambiguate again, and then you reambiguate, right? Like breathing in and out, like the heartbeat, right? So we're not doing that. No one taught us this. We can learn it. We can learn the process of intelligent reambiguation together. And in a sense, in this video, we're doing a little bit of that. But we are trained to disambiguate, and that fails. It's like trying to walk with one leg. You know, maybe you can hop if you're lucky for a little while. So there's a lot of problems here that make it very difficult for us to make progress as a species or as in collectives. You know, the scientists have been materialistic for a long time, meaning like we just want to look at the physical phenomena. That's the stuff that we can test. That's the stuff we can have proofs of. We want testing and proofs. We want data and then interpretations of data. But the data that we're looking for is just the physical stuff, right? And so science proceeds as if the psyche, that's just a bunch of stuff we want to get rid of. Consciousness, yeah, probably an epiphenomenon of the functioning of the brain. There's this materialistic backdrop. And by the way, there's no proof for this, right? There's, like, if you wanted to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, the claim that time, space, and matter in organisms are essentially just machines is the most ridiculous claim you could possibly come up with. Where's the evidence for that? There's no evidence. In science, you're supposed to have evidence if you want to make a truth claim, right? So science is operating under a vast array of delusions, and those delusions are very useful in a certain scope, right? If you want a grasp on physical reality, which again is like probably 2% of what's going on, go ahead and dismiss everything else, right? And science makes progress by doing this. But what we call science today is nothing like what it should be. Science should be the open exploration of phenomena and their origin, nature, meaning, and what they are, what they portend, right? We don't know what light is a manifestation of. In fact, we don't know what anything is, right? All we have are these collections of rules about things that allow us to predict the future of a physical system. Very useful in a limited scope, But if you take that and then project it over everything, that's an attack on the supercontainer. Your lexicons collapse into that nonsense. And now you can't make progress, right? You'll still make progress in that tiny little zone, but your ontology will be fundamentally deceptive. So that's the situation we're in. And people like Avi Loeb, who has started the Galileo project, they are aware of this, right? But they're facing the leviathan of the existing ontologies in science, and those ontologies attack them, right? Because these people are deeply invested in those ontologies, their academic positions, funding, and so on. And anything that might threaten any of that, they will reject it out of hand, right? They'll just say, like, you guys are making stuff up. So the Galileo project is really crucial. And because it has the potential to transform our lexicons, right? And to transform the way we pursue scientific understanding. And so I'm a huge fan of that. It's still a highly structured thing within the confines of academia and so on, but that's a really good direction to travel in. Now, okay, so what can we get some kind of a grip on what's going on? There's all kinds of stories in the background here, and there's stories about the origin of our religions. And I've heard a variety of people talking about this. One gentleman in particular on the Concrete podcast, an African-American man, who looks into anomalies and is very interested in ancient civilizations and so on. And there's this sort of background story where it doesn't begin with Zecharia Sitchin, but he's one of the people in that sort of circle, where there were wars between non-human intelligences that involved the Earth. The humans are either the result of these wars or are a kind of slave species that was used for certain purposes during certain features of these conflicts, that our religions are actually about non-human intelligences, not necessarily extraterrestrials, but possibly, and when I say extraterrestrials, I'm referring to physical organisms that spawned on other planets. It looks like something far weirder is going on than anything we ordinarily think. There are stories that that our Bible and so on, these are the results of mistranslations of ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets in which certain parts of the Bible are clearly articulated, and that the origins of the Torah come from these sort of displacements of narratives from far more ancient civilizations, that the pyramids and so on are the result of technological events that occurred 10 or more thousand years ago, and all of this kind of stuff. Now, I don't want to dismiss any of this, but the problem is we have this telephone game, right, of how knowledge gets transmitted down the generations, and it gets wildly mistransmitted. And there were things like encryption and disinformation, and the desire for specific groups of humans to hold on to specific cognitive, relational, spiritual, and mechanical technologies. So it's very difficult to intelligently disambiguate this information. Now, one of the things that's been going on, I just want to acknowledge these histories, because the idea of angels and so on, the fact that we have all these inscriptions of beings with wings, right? Those don't just mean, those wings don't mean wings. They mean the capacity to travel in time, space, and in consciousness, right? They mean something like the capacity to have a position in consciousness that is above all individual minds, right? And participates directly in all individual minds over all of time space, right? Those wings mean to travel in the network of consciousness over the entire manifold of time-space and to assemble subpositions of consciousness in all minds in all of time and networks of those subpositions. That's what those wings most likely refer to. They don't merely refer to, oh, these things fly. And the birds on Earth are, in a way, a physicalization of that capacity to travel, right? Most of the forms of life on Earth, I mean, all of the forms of life, they are representations of the character and nature of time-space. The praying mantis, the octopus, the tiger, the owl, the bear. These are almost as if time-space made children of itself, whose forms, natures, and activities represented its character. Right? So the living library of Earth is a representation of the nature of all of time and all of space, all the living worlds, right? Each living world is could be understood as like a derivation, a crystallization of these features of the intelligences that are native to all of time, all of space, all living worlds. So in a sense, if life wasn't engineered, right? If life just evolved the way we think it did, which I think is wildly unlikely, but let's just accept that for a moment, then each of the forms represent those characters and natures in time, space, and the intelligences therein. It looks like when there are if we imagine craft, right, vehicles, and we imagine beings in those craft, it's not clear that those are extraterrestrials. There may be some percentage of the phenomenon that are, but more than likely what's going on is that they are something that resembles a partly spiritual and partly physical technology, right? So that you could just create bodies in which other intelligences could indwell that were created just for specific missions or purposes. And then you could dissolve those bodies later because they're not individuals. The intelligence that dwells in those bodies does not go away when the body collapses, right? It goes back to a superposition, and then a new set of bodies is created, right? Maybe 4 different kinds. And then those intelligences indwell in those bodies. And they're partly biotechnological, right? They may not even have something resembling organs. They look like they don't have reproductive organs. They probably don't usually eat food. They're not like anything that fits in our lexicons, and they can directly affect human consciousness in dramatic ways, right? Catastrophically dramatic ways. So whatever's going on is probably almost certainly not mostly physical organisms from other planets in time-space. I'm going to pause here. I'll be back shortly. So since the last recording I made on this topic, I've taken in a vast amount of new information, and I'm not someone who's interested in belief, right? And opinion is also not terribly interesting to me. What orients me is insight. And for most of human history, insight was not sort of a materialistic epistemology. Insight was a broad field of direct experience, thought and understanding, participation in phenomena, and then sort of lastly, models and language. Most of the indigenous peoples did not treat language the way that we do. They were aware of the dangers of believing language, of belief in general, and how the participatory aspects of our consciousness and nature collapse into statements. if I've often joked that there should have been a 0th commandment in the Bible, thou shalt not declare. And I think that might be sort of more the spirit of what was meant by don't swear, right? Do not swear by blah, 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 blah. We are at the opposite end of that spectrum. We moderns, most of us, those of us who are not familiar with the dangers of declarative language, we live in a world of beliefs, opinions, concepts, maps, and models. And most of us are prone or inclined to replace experience with concepts, maps, models, declarations, and so on. And again, this is an incredible tragedy. It's just as bad as being in a physical prison, in different ways, right, than being in a physical prison is. So part of my goal in making the videos and my writings and so on is to give us some catalysts, right, that can show us at least a direction to travel in away from this kind of confusion that is blinding and spiritually crippling, relationally crippling, behaviorally crippling. This topic is really profound because it points outside our common ideas, lexicons, and so on. Some of the information that I've looked at, and most of the people who are talking about this are trying to figure out what the truth is. That's the wrong goal, right? We're not going to get at the truth because our ontologies, epistemologies, and lexicons have nothing to do with that. Excuse me for just a moment. In fact, this topic represents the greatest threat to those of maybe any topic ever. We have made leaps that transformed parts of our lexicons, particularly in the dimension of physics, and also in the dimension of biology. But the first topic, physics, is much more impactful because we use it to build machines. Whereas the topic of biology trickles down into our lexicons much more slowly. Physics impacts our lexicons at a much higher rate. The pulse rate is much higher than the findings in biology do. The findings in biology are profound enough to transform our lexicons dramatically, but it will take a long, long time. And physics will take a long, long time too. One of the interesting things that Avi Loeb mentioned was the incredible resistance of the scientific community to explore these phenomena. And he made a really good analogy. He said, I think there's something like the opposite of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that is that, look, we built the Large Hadron Collider in an attempt to understand features of physics that were certainly bizarre and counterintuitive. And so what he says is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary research, and that's more the spirit of science, right? The opposite conclusion, let's stick to what we know is true, right, is absurd, because what we know is true is less than like 0.001% of what's accessible to us. So if we stick to what we know is true, we're going to make progress that just crawls along at an infinitesimal rate and doesn't affect our lexicon's biases, presuppositions, terracentrism, anthropocentrism, and so on, but protects those things. I remember having a conversation about this topic with a friend, and he was like, show me the data. I don't believe in any of this. There's something going on in the sky that it has anything to do with other intelligences or aliens or blah, blah, blah. You know, until you show me the evidence, I don't care. And I said something like, is the limit of the facts the limit of your thought? And he balked for a moment and then kind of said no, but was very intent on maintaining his position. And this is the difference between knowledge and insight. Now, there's this problem in the Bible in Genesis with the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And it turns out that God in the story, and there's probably, this story looks like it was cribbed from a vast story, right? We got a little tiny piece of a vast story, and there was a telephone game, and the story was reinterpreted, and so on. So there's a problem with knowledge. When conceptual knowledge rules over consciousness, our capacity for insight is stillborn. Once again, this returns to the topic of the difference between intelligent disambiguation or unintelligent disambiguation and intelligent reambiguation. And everyone's concerned about insanity, right? They're like, well, you can't just make shit up. Okay, but that was actually the origin of every insight in knowledge that we ever acquired. We started out by making things up, and then we went around testing them. Now, it's true that there are forms of reambiguation that are delusional, but even those forms often contain key seeds of insight that are just being overprojected. So if we want understanding, we have to seek insight, not just facts, right? And actually, the idea of facts, while useful in a very narrow context in which we've established some functional maps, when that escapes that context and gets projected onto the entirety of the possibilities of consciousness, thought, or spirituality, again, stillborn minds, right? Minds incapable of moving. You can imagine a bird whose wings are chained to its body, and the birds wander around, these intelligent birds wander around in their society talking about flight, never having flown. That's the problem that we have with representational cognition as a species. We are effectively, cognitively, relationally, behaviorally, and in terms of the faculties available to us as humans, we undergo a series of historically originating amputations and circumcisions, right? And this we call education. That's not education, that's slavery. Now I want to go back, I'm going to circle back to a part of this topic that I spoke of earlier. There are a lot of stories, and I'm not really concerned with whether or not they're true. I'm not really concerned with whether I believe them or not. What I'm concerned with is, do they grant us the possibility of useful insight? And for most of human history, this is what hypothesis meant. It didn't mean a model that matches the facts and allows us to make emphatic or explicit predictions about the future states of systems or the past states of systems, physical systems. That idea arises mostly around the time of Galileo, though there are some precursors. Prior to that, the idea of hypothesis was an intelligent reambiguation that gave us insight, right? Now, the problem at the tree of knowledge is that we are given something by a non-human intelligence, which is envisioned as a serpent, and that's important in a variety of ways that we'll leave out. That serpent isn't Satan. Right? The idea of Satan in the Bible is very vague and differently framed for different purposes. One moment. So in the conversation between Eve and the serpent, The serpent's like God says, the tree of knowledge will be death for you. And the serpent says, well, it won't actually be death, and it is good for seeing, right? In a way, the serpent is going to introduce the capacity for having a knife in the mind, a knife that makes cuts in the manifold of being and produces concepts and names and hierarchies of derivations over the holophores, the root concepts, right? And this is a complex story which I don't have the time to elucidate here, but knowledge that is explicit and divisive is the opposite of insight. It's the dead remains of insight. It's the corpse of previous insights, right? And so, in a way, our species is addicted to these dead representations of previous insights, and we call this knowledge. It doesn't kill us in our bodies. We are still alive in our bodies for the time we are alive, but it kills us in our minds. And there was a second tree where after we ate of the first tree, God or the gods said, okay, let us guard the tree of life, right, which is the tree of spiritual origin, memory, insight, wisdom, and so on. We'll place an angel there with a sword that spins in every direction. By the way, that forms a sphere that is impenetrable. Yeah. Anything that attempts to penetrate that is obliterated, or at least repulsed. So this story is very important. We need to understand the difference between knowledge and insight, between knowledge and wise relation, between the facts and the potentials for insight and relationship. The facts represent the structured absence of relational intimacy, right? And you can understand that very easily even if we just look at romantic partners that we have, right? If we were to relate with them based on the facts, love would be dead, right? It would just be a relationship that operationalizes utility, which is what most of knowledge and how humans use knowledge does. That stuff is dead inside. And our minds collapse into a kind of zombie-like absence of relational wonder, intimacy, awe, discovery, exploration, learning, play, joy, ecstasy. All of that stuff just dies down into sort of the bones of it, which we can then manipulate somehow. Now, going back, there are a number of people, a large number of people, who believe, right, that all of our religions come from the early experiences of NHI interaction with humans, and that the angels actually represent beings that dwell in a superposition to physical biology and have the capacity to influence, direct, engineer consciousness and physical biologies. And so again, there are these stories that there were sort of like two factions and they were at war and the humans were involved in this in various ways. And that they were involved in engineering the humans. I read a very bizarre and interesting story that purports to be a record of a nurse who interviewed an alien that was captured at Roswell. And once again, have no interest in, is this true or not? What's interesting is in what ways can we acquire insight from reading or being exposed to information like this? And that story was very similar. It was like there were two factions, they were fighting. One was called the Old Empire, and one was called the Domain. And the Domain were sort of the good guys, the Empire were the bad guys. In this story, Earth is a prison planet where spirit beings that are called is-bees, is-be, are imprisoned here and used as slaves. And our memories are erased when we die, which normally doesn't happen. And there was this long war, which is still going on, circa 1947. And it was a kind of a terrifying story. I don't know whether the record is an accurate record of something that actually took place or not. But the story was very useful, and there are many similar stories that imply that human religion is mostly not related to the being that dwells in unity or God, but rather represents historical relation between our species and an array of non-human intelligences that are not merely physical and may create forms for missions, inhabit them, dissolve those forms, go back to superposition, create new forms, inhabit them, and so forth. There was also, there's been a couple of threads on Reddit lately in Are Aliens? One is older and talks about a guy who was reverse engineering technology that was in possession of the United States government. And that person claimed that non-human intelligences have bases on Earth and have for thousands of years. They have bases on other planets in the solar system that are underground. That some of the stories claim that many of the planets in the solar system were previously inhabited, and over time, the beings that inhabited them became technological and moved underground. Let's see here. So this particular post thread claimed that the craft that we see are both, and this is a common claim now, that many of the craft that we see are actually craft designed from reverse engineering by the U.S. government and are manned by, human pilots. There are many stories that claim that the actual craft themselves cannot be controlled by humans because there is a non-cognitive, non-physical component to the control systems of the craft. Effectively, the craft are like biotechnological extensions of a situation that is superpositional, right, to ordinary physical reality. And so that the beings that the forms that pilot and inhabit these craft have specific biophysical features that allow them to integrate with the technology directly and control it with their minds, essentially, with their consciousness, rather than, there may be physical aspects too, but humans can't. We don't have the biotech features of our bodies that would allow us to control the craft that we've recovered, presuming that there are some that are intact. And so the story is that many of the things that we see in the sky are actually, there's humans in there. There's humans from the United States in there. And that some other portion of them are actually non-human. One of the interesting features, there's this theme that keeps recurring in these stories, which is that, so the Reddit post thread, the reverse engineering guy, he said that the craft are sort of formed for a specific purpose. They fulfill that purpose and then they return and are dissolved and then are reformed. This is really interesting to me for a number of reasons. it's clear that an actually intelligent society would not make um, stable, continuously present physical technologies, right? Imagine the difference between uh, a species that builds automobiles and then builds billions of the same automobiles, and a species that builds an automobile for a purpose. The purpose is fulfilled. It recovers all those parts and then builds a vastly better automobile, and it just keeps doing that, right? This looks more like an intelligent relationship with technology, especially environmentally, right? Um, so this was the implication of that post thread. And again, it's not a matter of if I believe it or not. I'm not trying to believe anything. I'm trying to understand. I want a superposition above the phenomenon that encompasses it but doesn't collapse it into beliefs, opinions, and so forth. So there's this similar idea with the forms that inhabit or that are inside such vehicles, right? These forms are composed for a specific purpose. Once the purpose is accomplished, the form is dissolved, and the being that was associated with a form or a group of forms just returns to superposition, retains all of its memory, ability, intelligence, and history, and then new forms are composed for other purposes, and again, there may be a group of such forms into which an intelligence indwells. And those forms are something like a complex conjugation of biotech, maybe nanotech, artificial intelligence, and consciousness, right? So it's obvious that when humans encounter these situations, something dramatic happens to their consciousness in most cases. And it is as if these beings are in a superposition of physical reality and consciousness, and their proximity or contact with any terrestrial phenomenon transforms the whole reference frame, right? So that now the humans have access to features of their consciousness that are native to us, but unfamiliar to our experience. Therefore, we easily experience telepathy, soul travel, transformations in time, all of these kinds of things. So all of these concepts are important for us to bear in mind. It's nearly impossible that whatever it is we're talking about, and again, that's an array of phenomena, fit into anything that resembles our familiar lexical, elements. It would actually destroy the structure of our lexicons to encounter this phenomenon directly because it doesn't fit. And I understand this personally from my own experience, right? In my own experience, the phenomenon didn't fit into any category. Like at first it seemed like I was having a cascade of incredible insights about the nature of language, science, minds, consciousness. And then it seemed like an alien was teaching me their lexicon and sharing some of their experience with me so that I could have it as my own, sort of like mind sharing, right? And then it seemed like, as the experience progressed over time, and then it seemed like, oh, it was a group of alien intelligences that were speaking through one voice. And then it seemed like, oh, these aren't alien intelligences, these are angels. And then it seemed like these aren't merely angels, this is the entire collective of angelic minds. And it continued to grow beyond that. So it was like climbing a ladder slowly. And that process went on for 9 months, and the repercussions have been, sort of flowing into my awareness, thought, conceptualization, and so forth over the years since that experience. And there was a second experience that was different but very similar. So there's, like, if you can't just come to modern humans and say, there are beings that are not merely physical. There's a vast web of intelligences in time space. They can appear as physical or paraphysical to communicate with humans or the biosphere, and then they can dissolve back into superposition. There's no way for modern humans to understand this. It would obliterate our lexicons and place us in ontological and epistemological shock, right? Our world images would shatter. Our ways of knowing, how we know what we know, would shatter. And the history and meaning of being human would be completely transformed in ways that it's impossible to predict. Common humans walking around doing their jobs would probably undergo like an array of catastrophic, psychotic, and schizophreniform experiences. And nobody wants that. I don't believe, again, we don't even have a societal cohort that is, it's not entirely true that we don't have one in the community of UFO believers, which very much resembles an array of religions. There might be cohorts that are advanced enough, or individuals that are advanced enough to form such cohorts that would be capable of interacting relatively intelligently with such phenomena. But the idea that the government is going to come forward and say, like, yeah, we've got craft from non-human intelligences, we've got bodies, they've been interacting with us apparently for thousands of years, we've interviewed some live non-human forms, and they've told us things different. They've told us different things, right? We've got different stories from different encounters and different, interviews. So it's impossible to disambiguate something like that, right? If you get one story about what the universe is over here and another one over here from non-human bodies that we can talk to in some way, the government would be incredibly confused. And there might be people in the government that aren't incredibly confused, but who are they? Where are they're not likely to come forward and become spokespeople or anything like this. So we're left in a situation where our ontology is clearly monumentally primitive, our ontologies, and our epistemologies are crude and primitive, and our technologies, in comparison to what we're, in some kind of a relationship with, are similarly extremely primitive and mostly based on war rather than learning, right? If you looked at the amount of money that is available for the actual pursuit of understanding as compared to the monies that are invested in physical technologies, war, commercial technologies, and even biotechnology is captured by the pharmaceutical industry. So you're talking about like 98% of our investment has nothing to do with acquiring awareness, understanding, or insight. It has everything to do with continuing these malware-like processes that are the opposite of an operating system that our societies run on. And those things are not going to introduce their own antidote, right? They're not going to introduce something that would destabilize their grasp on power, enslaving humans, ripping the environment to shreds for dollars and influence and so on. So I think what will probably take place, my prediction is, it's possible that the non-human intelligences will take an opportunity sometime soon, and of course I have some experience of this, of contacting individual humans that they feel might be able to sort of a slow drip, right, to invest, to speak and invest intelligence and awareness in the human population. The problem with that is most of the people who experience anything resembling my own experience, and according to Diane Paluska, there are many other people who are able to essentially like download insight or technologies from non-human intelligences that they have some kind of an ongoing relationship with. And that's familiar to me as well. Various technologies were shown to me in principle during my own experience. I did not choose to pursue them because, well, for a wide variety of reasons yet. The problem, though, is that when people have these experiences, they become religious about them and they form concepts. When you have an experience that doesn't fit into your lexicon, you have to narratize it. You have to translate it into something you can understand, say, articulate, and so forth. And in that translation process, what happens is the nature of the experience collapses into common language concepts and so on. This is why I use the words like alien and angel and blah, blah, blah. What I actually encountered doesn't exist in human lexicons. So I'm picking words from human lexicons that at least slightly resemble what I made of my experience. And this is the problem. When people have experience, they have to make something of it. They have to sort of digest it and then produce something that resembles a narrative. And so even if non-human intelligences are selecting humans and speaking and communicating with them and giving them insight and experience and knowledge and so forth, the problem is that gets religified. And that is the antithesis of insight, right? That's the collapsed, dead version of something that needs to remain in a living superposition above the lexical tokens and concepts and so forth. The topic is infinitely deep, right? It's clear that the governments of the world, but particularly the United States, have been introducing hoaxes and disinformation and so on in order to deceptively ambiguate the phenomena and keep people ready to dismiss it, right? Oh, there have been 50,000 hoaxes. That whole topic is nonsense, right? That introduction of noise into the channel is a well-known information warfare tactic. And the government has clearly been doing that and is still doing that. That's the best way for them to keep the topic under wraps and keep control of the narrative in the population, right? And that seems to be the goal of the government in the United States. It's difficult from, like, there's a background topic here, which is that we need to reboot our societies, right? We're running straight up malware. And the longer it runs, the more entrenched it becomes and the more likely that it will produce a world-ending catastrophe for humans and life on Earth. So the most urgent imperative for modern Homo sapiens is the development of intelligent societies. The Game B program that Daniel Schmachtenberger is involved with is it might be the most important idea that humans have ever had. The technologies that I was shown during my own experience were technologies that were specifically focused on creating intelligent human societies and involve the development of internet that is wildly different in its orientations, purposes, technologies, and outcomes than, what we have now is just a disease-spreading nightmare. I'm not saying there's no useful content on the internet, but social media is a devastating information warfare weapon that is completely unopposed. So we have to produce an internet that helps us get more intelligent together every time we touch machines, and also gives us privacy. It's fundamentally crucial that humans have privacy. It's crucial to our minds, to our mental health, to our capacities for insight, and to the possibilities of awakening the faculties we bring to human birth that are inhibited by the sort of current regime. So the topic, again, it's infinitely deep, and there's so many different features of it, but I've covered most of what I intended to talk about today. And so for now, I just want to thank you for listening and learning together with me. I hope for a future in which we can become more intelligent together and form teams that support each other in our lives and education and development, and that can protect or transform the current situation in our societies, because if it continues like this, we are certainly going to wipe out at least the ecologies and almost certainly our species, or most of it. There are people who argue like, oh, the Earth's resilient, she's been through crises before. That's like arguing that your grandmother survived her first stroke, so it's no problem to like give her another one, right? She'll get over it. That's insane. The actual beings that exist here now matter, right? And the people who want to dismiss that and say like, the humans aren't important, life will start over again, blah blah blah. Those people know nothing about the situation here. They don't realize that the sun has a lifespan, and within that lifespan, there's a specific zone in which life on Earth can flourish. And we may be outside the zone or closing in on the membrane barrier, where if you wipe out most of life on Earth, there won't be enough time. There are so many features of the relationship between the Earth, the sun, and the moon, and local time space that humans have no knowledge of. So when people make dismissive statements like, oh, the Earth will recover, like I said, it's like saying, well, my mom survived a stroke last time, let's give her another one, I'm sure she'll be fine. It's just insane, like stupid. Life on Earth matters. The Earth is doing something in time space. She's a being, she has a role. The sun is a being, has a role. The moon also has a role and is a being. The idea that these are just dead mechanical processes is dumber than shoe leather, right? So it's crucially important that we protect the biorelational manifold that currently is still largely recoverable, right? It's not intact. We've torn it to shreds, but it's at least recoverable for the moment. So it's absolutely urgent that we learn together and help each other to develop intelligent cohorts, societies, teams, and missions that would give us meaningful roles in our human experience day to day. And this is the thing that humans are most hungry for, individual humans. They want meaningful roles. If you give them something that's deeply meaningful, you can create a situation where we're doing something that's so amazing, so beautiful, so ecstatic, and so exciting that we don't want to do anything else. And that's the direction that I think we can go in. We can't fight the existing processes. We have to develop something that can outcompete them. And that's my hope and my dream. And I think the dream of life on Earth and the entire history of our species. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and share. I would love to hear your ideas, corrections, and so forth. If you want, on my YouTube channel, there's a place where you can support me on Patreon, and I would greatly appreciate even the smallest amount of support. $1 a month would make a big difference. So if you can do that, thank you. And even if you can't, thank you for listening. I hope I've given you some food for insight and expanded some of your thoughts about these matters. I also welcome personal contact from people who've had direct experience or want to discuss that in an intelligent and meaningful way. Bye-bye for now. May your dreams be amazing and beautiful.